You come to every dinner like you've earned a seat at this table, Dad. My son said it the way people say things they've been rehearsing for a while. Calm, deliberate, making sure every word landed. But you haven't, you bought one. And if you disappeared tomorrow? We'd miss the money, not you. I drove away from that house in the dark and the cold. 4 days later, my son had 41 missed calls on a phone I was still paying for. The accounts were frozen. The house keys didn't work. And I was sitting at the Fairmont Palace Ellisor, watching everything he thought he'd built collapse on a screen the size of my hand. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Nolan Creighton. I'm 67 years old, and I spent 35 years building pipeline infrastructure across northern Alberta. I know how to read a frost map. I know how to drive iron pipe through permafrost at -40 without losing a man. I've pulled 14-hour days in Fort McMurray when the temperature was so low the diesel gelled in the tanks before you could get a rig fired up. I started with a borrowed backhoe and a cardboard business plan, and I built something that lasted. I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying it so you understand what kind of man I am before I tell you about the worst night of my life and what I did about it. My son Curtis is 38 years old. He grew up watching me work and decided early that the watching was the better arrangement. He's not stupid. He's charming. He plays golf. He has a handshake for every occasion and a laugh that fills a room. When he was 26, I gave him a title at Creighton & Associates, the engineering firm I'd spent 2 decades building. Senior project coordinator. I told myself he'd grow into it. What I didn't tell myself, not out loud anyway, was that I'd arranged things so he wouldn't have to. His wife, my daughter-in-law, is 33, and she describes herself as a wellness and lifestyle creator. As far as I can tell, this means she photographs herself near things she doesn't own, in rooms she doesn't clean, eating food she doesn't cook. She has 220,000 followers. She doesn't have a job. What she has is a supplemental credit card on my account, with a monthly limit I'd set at $8,000, and she treated as a suggestion. They live in Tuscany, a neighborhood in the northwest of Calgary, the kind of place where every house looks like the builder ran out of ideas halfway through the floor plan. The house is 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, a 2-car garage. I bought it in 2019 and placed it in the Creighton Family Trust. My daughter-in-law signed the trust documents without reading them. My son skimmed them and said, "Looks good, Dad." The same thing he said about the employment contract, the car lease, the benefits package I'd set up through the firm. Looks good. Looking has always been his strongest skill. My grandson, Eli, is 8 years old. He is the best thing in this story, and the most important reason I did what I did. It was December 21st, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. That turned out to be appropriate. I drove from my condo in Eau Claire across the city with a backseat full of wrapped gifts because my son had mentioned twice that my daughter-in-law was really stressed about the holidays, and I didn't want to add to it by showing up empty-handed. The temperature on my dashboard read -22. A Chinook had been threatening all week and hadn't arrived. The Bow River was frozen solid. When I got to the house, my daughter-in-law was arranging a ring light in the dining room. She had spread linen across the table as a photography backdrop, and I recognized it. It was from the cedar chest in the basement, my late wife Lenora's tablecloth, the one she'd brought from her mother's house in Cape Breton, a piece of our family. My daughter-in-law had pulled it out to use as content for a holiday post. She didn't look up when I came in. She said, "Can you move to the left? You're in the frame." She has never called me anything other than my first name. My son was at the kitchen island, pouring himself a glass from a bottle of Okanagan Red I recognized from the case I'd dropped off in October, a vintage I'd been saving. He hadn't asked. He poured without looking up, without offering, without acknowledgement. He was on his phone. He said, "Hey," at the wall. Eli came running down the stairs in his hockey socks. He grabbed my hand. "Grandpa, I scored twice at practice today." He was the only warm thing in that house. We sat down to eat. The food was catered. I could tell from the packaging visible in the recycling bin, 3 containers from a place on 14th Street that charges $40 a person. It had gone through my daughter-in-law's supplemental card, the one on my account, without my knowledge or any mention of it. I said nothing about that. What I said something about was the notification that arrived on my phone while we were finishing the main course. A charge alert. $34,000 to a company called Amplify Brand Studio. I knew that name. My accountant had flagged it 2 months earlier as a recurring charge my daughter-in-law had been running through the card for what she described as professional development. $34,000. Professional development. I set my fork down. I kept my voice level. I said, "There's a charge here I need to understand. $34,000 to Amplify Brand Studio. What is that?" My daughter-in-law's hands stopped moving. My son's jaw tightened. He set down the wine. "It's for the business, Dad. Her platform is a business. You don't understand how this works." $34,000 isn't a platform, I said. That's a salary. A salary I didn't agree to pay for a job I wasn't consulted on. My daughter-in-law said, "Nolan, could you not do this right now? It's Christmas. Could you, for one night, just not make everything about money?" Something shifted in the room. My son stood up from the table. He was wearing a cashmere sweater I'd given him 2 birthdays ago. His face went from tense to something harder, the expression of a man who had been waiting for permission to say something for a long time and had just decided to say it anyway. "You know what, she's right," he said. "You come to every dinner like you've earned a seat at this table, Dad." He said it slowly, measuring each word. "But you haven't. You bought one. And if you disappeared tomorrow, we'd miss the money. Not you." My daughter-in-law made a short sound. Surprised and satisfied, the kind of laugh that escapes before you can pretend to be decent. My son kept going. "You walk around like you built this family the same way you built your company. Like we're employees who should be grateful. We're tired of it. We're tired of you." I looked at my grandson. He had gone very still in his chair. He was staring at his plate. He was 8 years old, and he understood that something irreversible was happening at that table. I stood up slowly. My knees have been reminding me of my age since I turned 60. I placed my napkin beside my plate, folded along the crease, the way my mother taught me. I did not raise my voice. I had nothing left to say that they were capable of hearing. I walked to the front door. My coat was on the hook. I took it. I took my gloves from the pocket. My son shouted something at me about coming back when I'd sorted out my attitude. My daughter-in-law said, "Let him go," with the patience of someone who has already decided what chapter this is. I walked out into the -22 night. I got into my F-250, a 2016 with a dent in the passenger door from a job site. They had asked me more than once to park it on the street because it looked out of place next to the Audi and the Jeep. I always parked it in the driveway. I turned the engine over, let it warm up, and drove away without looking back. I pulled over at a Tim Hortons on Crowfoot Trail. I sat in the drive-thru, not moving until the car behind me honked. I ordered a black coffee. I sat in the parking lot with it going cold in my hands. Then I called Isadora Webb. She'd been my legal counsel for 22 years. She drafted my corporate agreements, handled the estate when Lenora died, and designed the Creighton Family Trust with what she called the Clearwater provisions. "Named," she said, "for how clean the water runs when the floodgates finally open." She answered on the second ring. "Nolan, is everything all right?" "No," I said. "I need you to open the Clearwater file." A pause. "How wide?" "Full scope," I said, "tonight." "I want to be honest about something here because I know what some people will say. You made him this way." And that's true. I know it. When my son failed out of engineering school in his 2nd year, I didn't let him find his own path. I called in a favor. I built a position around his limitations and called it a career. I paid his salary out of my own dividend returns from the firm and let him believe it was merit. His clients were my old contacts, people who returned calls as a courtesy to me. Without me behind him, there was nothing behind him. I did that. I own it entirely. But owning a mistake doesn't mean you have to keep making it. I checked into the Palliser. I took a room on the 9th floor and ordered room service. And I opened the security app on my phone. I had installed the system in the Tuscany house the previous spring, after my daughter-in-law mentioned, casually, over the phone, that they were thinking of converting the basement suite and hadn't gotten around to discussing it with me. The cameras covered the common areas. I watched them go back to dinner after I left. I watched my son pour more wine. I watched my daughter-in-law edit photos on her laptop at the table. I watched Eli carry his plate to the kitchen alone, rinse it carefully, and stand at the sink for a long time staring out the dark window. For 2 days, they circled the drains I'd opened. On the first day, my daughter-in-law drove to Market Mall and tried the supplemental card at 3 stores. Declined, card flagged, each time. She called my son from the parking lot. He was in the shower. By the time he called back, she was already home, slamming cupboards. On the second day, my son tried to buy gas at the Petro-Canada on Sarcee Trail. Company card declined at the pump. Personal Visa, also canceled. Emergency MasterCard, canceled. I had closed everything simultaneously the night I left. He borrowed $30 in cash from the woman behind the counter. She did not look impressed. He called me 41 times across those 4 days. I let it ring. On the third morning, Isadora made the call to the managing partners at Creighton and Associates. My son walked into that boardroom believing what he had always believed. That his salary was his, that the corner office and the expense account and the company car were rewards for talent he had developed on his own. The managing partner showed him the equity structure, showed him that for 11 years his salary had been routed through the firm's payroll as a draw against my shareholder returns, showed him that his client list consisted entirely of my former contacts, maintained on the ledger as a professional courtesy to me, not to him. Without that courtesy, there was no role. The new ownership group had audited the position. A senior coordinator who had billed fewer hours than a co-op student, whose golf game was impeccable, whose contributions were undetectable. They did not need a mascot. He walked out of that office at 10:15 in the morning with a cardboard box and a parking validation that had already expired. 4 days after Christmas dinner, the eviction notice was served at the house in Tuscany. Isadora had drafted it herself. The Creighton Family Trust owned the property. My daughter-in-law's right of residency was contingent on what the trust documents called a respectful relationship with the grantor. The smart speaker in the dining room had captured the full conversation from that night. Timestamp, complete audio, my son's voice saying, "We'd miss the money, not you," attached as Appendix B. My daughter-in-law was informed that the furniture was trust property. The art was trust property. The walk-in closet full of things she had been photographing for 4 years. Each piece traceable to my supplemental card through forensic accounting was trust property. She could take what she had bought with her own money. She had no own money. Marcelo, the retired CN rail safety officer I'd brought in to oversee the logistics, a man as solid and quiet as a railway tie, had a list from Isadora of every item purchased on accounts in my name. He supervised while they packed. They left with 3 plastic bins and a hockey bag. Both cars stayed. Neither lease was in my son's name. I watched from the security feed on my phone as they loaded a taxi in the driveway. I watched my daughter-in-law walk down the path of the house she had redecorated twice without consulting me, wearing a puffer jacket from a sale rack, one of the only things in that house she had actually paid for herself. The neighbors were watching. Lake Forest, Tuscany. On a quiet street, the sight of a security team and 3 plastic bins tells a story that spreads fast. I put the phone down. I sat in the hotel room and listened to the quiet. Then Marcelo called. "There's something in the basement. You should see." I went back to the house the next morning. We went down to the storage room. The heavy shelving unit along the back wall had been pulled away from the plaster. I could see the scrape marks across the concrete floor. Behind it, a gap in the drywall. Rough cut, unfinished, no permit. Inside the gap, a fireproof document box with a combination lock that had been drilled open. 7 promissory notes. The letterhead read Tundra Capital. The interest rates were printed in the smallest legal font. I was wearing my reading glasses. I read every word. The notes totaled $480,000. The dates began 18 months ago and escalated fast. Each note larger than the one before it, the way debt does when you're borrowing to cover interest rather than to solve anything. The collateral listed on each note was equipment: drilling rigs, survey gear, a Cat 336 excavator, 2 D6 dozers, all registered assets of Creighton and Associates, assets I owned. The signature on the collateral guarantee was mine. It was not mine. The loop on the C was wrong. My signature on legal documents has a specific slant I developed in my 40s when I was signing 50 documents a week. This was close, careful, but it was not my hand. My son had forged my name to borrow nearly $500,000 from people who were not a bank, using my equipment as security without my knowledge or consent. I know the name Tundra Capital from 25 years of conversations on job sites, over coffee in Fort McMurray, in the kind of talk that travels through the industry the way cold travels through a pipe, quietly, through everything. Tundra Capital is the name you hear when someone has run out of legitimate options and has started making choices they won't be able to explain. My son had 17 months of overdue payments on that note. I was standing in the cold basement working through what that meant when Marcelo's phone rang. He listened. He hung up. "Someone hit your truck in the parkade," he said. "Paint bomb, and there's a broken window in your room." Rock came through. Note attached. The note was block printed on the back of an invoice. "You signed for this. You own this. 72 hours. A phone number below. No name." I could have called the RCMP. I almost did. What stopped me was arithmetic. If this became a police matter before I had any leverage, my son would face criminal charges for the forgery. He would panic, he would run, and if he ran, he might take Eli with him. I called Isadora instead. She arranged a meeting. The man who came represented Tundra Capital, younger than I expected. He wore a good suit and had the eyes of someone who has had this conversation many times and is not moved by it. We sat across from each other at a rented boardroom table downtown, neutral ground. I laid out the facts simply. The signature was forged. The collateral was not authorized. Any enforcement action on their part would invite scrutiny of their lending practices that they would not enjoy. I was not threatening them. I was offering them a better deal than they currently held. "I'll buy the note," I said. 65 cents on the dollar. 312,000 wired today. Full transfer of the note, original documents, wet signatures. He becomes my debtor. Your problem ends this afternoon. He looked at Isadora. She looked at her laptop. 68, he said. 65, I said, and you walk away clean. 5 seconds, 10. He nodded. The wire cleared at 3:47 that afternoon. Isadora filed the assignment of note before 5 o'clock. My son's debt, every cent of it, was now mine. I was the most dangerous creditor he had. I was in the car with Marcelo heading back to the hotel when my son called from a number I didn't recognize. His voice had changed again. The arrogance from Christmas dinner was gone. The panic from 41 missed calls was gone too. What was left was something flatter, the tone of a man who has decided he has nothing left to lose. "I know you bought the paper," he said. "Tundra texted me. So you won. Congratulations." A pause. I picked Eli up from school this afternoon, half day. His teacher thought I was the father of the year type, coming in early for once. Another pause and my chest went cold. He's with me. I kept my voice steady. What do you want? I said. 800,000, offshore account. You transfer it by tomorrow noon. I bring Eli home. You don't, we go somewhere warm, somewhere without paperwork. He let that sit. It's just a family trip, Dad. Dads take their kids on trips. He hung up. My daughter-in-law, even in crisis, cannot stop performing for an audience. I'd had access to her close friend's story feed through her best friend's account. A woman who had agreed to screen record and forward the private posts in exchange for a figure that made her pause, and then agree very quickly. The most recent story had gone up 40 minutes after my son's call. My daughter-in-law, whispering to her phone in a dim room, red-eyed, her voice theatrical. We're safe. We're okay. We're just hiding from someone very powerful who has done terrible things to our family. Please send love. Behind her, textured wallpaper, green plaid, lodge-style, vintage and unrestored. I had driven past the Prairie Wind Inn in Cochrane 100 times over the years. That wallpaper was specific enough to recognize. A motel 30 minutes west of Calgary, on the highway toward the mountains. Marcelo drove. I texted my daughter-in-law from a burner phone. I'm parked outside the Prairie Wind. I know about the personal training arrangement at the Canyon Meadows Club. I have photographs. You have 10 minutes to send Eli out to the black truck by the office. In exchange, 40,000 in cash, a car to the airport, and everything I know stays with me. After tonight, you're done with this. Your decision. I watched the window for 9 minutes. On the 10th, the curtain moved. The door opened. My daughter-in-law peered out into the parking lot. She saw the truck idling. She stood very still. Then she pushed the door open wider, and my grandson walked out. He was in his school clothes from that morning, his backpack still on his shoulders, his coat half-zipped. He was trying not to cry in the way children do when they've decided to be brave, even though everything is wrong. He saw the truck. He ran. Marcelo got out and met him halfway across the lot and walked him to the passenger door with one steady hand on his shoulder. I threw the envelope across the snow. My daughter-in-law scrambled for it, counted the stacks once with shaking hands, zipped it inside her jacket. She did not look at her son. She walked quickly toward the highway, pulling her hood up, and disappeared into the dark. She had sold her family for $40,000. She thought she was getting the better end of the deal. Marcelo took Eli to the safe house I'd arranged, a friend's home in Cochrane, warm, stocked, with a television and a dog, and no more questions than a 9-year-old needed to field that night. I walked to room 12 alone. The door was unlocked. The room smelled of cigarettes and cheap rye whiskey. My son was on the bed, face down, still wearing the clothes they'd let him go in. An empty bottle was on the nightstand. His shoes were still on. He had handed the situation off to his wife and collapsed and expected someone else to manage what came next. He had done that his whole life. The pattern was so familiar it no longer surprised me. I stood there and looked at him for a moment. I looked at the man I had carried for 38 years, on job sites and in boardrooms, and through failures I'd quietly smoothed over before he ever felt the edges. I thought about the conversations we had never had, because I was always in too much of a hurry to get back to work. I thought about the things I had never asked him, because the answer might have been something I couldn't fix. I reached into my jacket and took out the promissory note, the original, transferred now to my name. I laid it on his chest. He didn't stir. I took a pen from the nightstand. On the back of the motel's checkout card, I wrote, "Ellie is safe. Your wife is gone. The debt is mine now, all of it, and I will collect it in whatever way I decide, at whatever pace I decide. You have nothing left to lose by being honest, and everything to gain. When you're ready, you know how to reach me. Dad." I set the note on the pillow beside him. I picked up his phone from the nightstand and carried it to the bathroom, and set it in the sink with the cold tap running. Then I walked out and pulled the door shut and stood in the parking lot of the Prairie Wind Inn in Cochrane, Alberta, at 11 o'clock on the longest night of the year. I breathed in air so cold it hurt all the way down. It was a good kind of pain, the kind that tells you you're still here. 11 months later, the raised garden beds in the backyard of the house in Tuscany were framed and waiting for spring. Eli had measured the cedar boards himself, with a tape measure I'd bought him for his 9th birthday. He checked every measurement twice before marking the cut line. I took that as a good sign. Again, I said, holding the board steady. He swung the hammer. The nail went in clean, flush with the wood, one smooth strike. Good, I said, that's the right angle. He studied the joint with the focus of someone who has just discovered that things can be done correctly if you pay attention. Why does it matter if it's straight? Because if it goes in crooked, I said, the wood splits. Doesn't matter how hard you swing, the angle is everything. He thought about that, the way kids think, completely, without pretending to understand before they do, and went back to work. My phone buzzed in my vest pocket, area code I didn't recognize. Northwest Territories, which meant Yellowknife or somewhere north of it, somewhere deep in the work. The message was a photo, a pair of leather work gloves, fingertips worn through, a hard hat with a sticker from Northern Gateway Pipeline Services, a sub-crew that works the Mackenzie Corridor, people I'd done business with 20 years ago. A payroll check stub, 83 hours at the laborer classification, base rate entry level. 2 weeks of honest work. Below the photo, my son had written, "This doesn't cover anything. I know that, but I earned every hour. My back's wrecked. My hands bleed in the cold. I share a bunkhouse with 6 guys who don't care who my father is. I've never slept better in my life. I'm sorry, Dad. I don't know if that matters yet. I just wanted you to know I'm here. See." I read it twice. I looked at the photograph of those torn gloves for a long time. Eli looked up from the board he was measuring. "Who is it?" I put the phone in my pocket. "Just a man I know," I said. "He's learning a trade." We finished the frame before the light went. Eli carried the leftover lumber to the garage piece by piece without being asked. He stacked it neatly against the wall, sorted by length. He came back and stood next to me, and we looked at what we'd built. "Will we grow tomatoes?" he asked. "We'll try," I said. "Tomatoes are hard this far north. But if you build the beds right and you're patient, sometimes they surprise you." He nodded like that made sense to him. It did. He is 8 years old, and he already understands that most things worth having require more than wanting them. I have built a lot of things in my life. Pipelines that run under rivers. Foundations that hold through a freeze-thaw cycle that would crack cheaper work. Bridges with my name in the concrete below the waterline, where no one sees it. I built all of it, thinking I understood what permanence meant. I was wrong about the most important kind. I spent 38 years shielding my son from the weight that builds the kind of person who can carry weight. I told myself that was love. What it was, mostly, was convenience. Mine. It was easier to absorb his failures than to let him feel them. It was easier to write the check than to have the conversation. And so I raised a man who had never once held his own hammer. He's holding one now, somewhere in the northern dark, and it has cost both of us more than it should have had to. The debt is being paid, slowly, in 83-hour increments, by hands that are finally learning what work feels like. I don't know if we will ever sit at the same table again. I don't know if that chapter gets written. What I know is that my grandson is measuring boards in my backyard, and he's doing it right, and no one handed him that. That's worth more than anything I ever built.